Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Ulysses S. Grant, The Unlikely Hero by Michael Korda. This book was originally published in 2004 by Penguin Books. This reissued version was published in 2013 by HarperCollins. It's 228 pages long. The original version of this book was part of what was called the Penguin Life series. And this was a collection of about 30 biographies, short biographies, published in a pocket format. And the gimmick of the Penguin Life series is that the authors were all non-historians and non-biographers. For example, the novelist Larry McMurtry wrote a biography of Crazy Horse. Bobby Ann Mason, the poet and novelist, wrote a biography of Elvis Presley. The Southern humorist Roy Blunt Jr. wrote a biography of Robert E. Lee. And the political writer Gary Wills wrote a biography of St. Augustine. Michael Korda is a British-born novelist and book editor. He was editor-in-chief at Simon & Schuster at one point. So none of these books in this series were written by actual historians. So if you are interested in a very detailed, comprehensive biography, this is not the book to go to. The idea here was to get someone who wasn't a historian, someone who was good at writing, to write a biography. And so the advantage this book has, and the other books in the Penguin series, is that they're very accessible. They're very readable, but they don't have the kind of detail, they don't have the footnotes and everything that you'd have from a standard academic biography. Okay, so, and I will talk a little bit at the end of this about the difference between this reissued version and the original Penguin version. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you go to the mall, at one end of the mall, there's a memorial for Abraham Lincoln. And at the other end of the mall, there's a memorial for Ulysses S. Grant, the two men facing each other basically across the mall in D.C. These two men, of course, working together, defeated the Confederacy during the Civil War. They reunited the United States and they ended slavery. And both of them wound up becoming presidents against incredible odds. Both of them came from very humble backgrounds. Everybody's familiar with Abraham Lincoln's story. He was born in a log cabin. His father was illiterate. His mother died when he was a child. He had very little formal education. He taught himself law and eventually worked his way up to through the Whig Party and then the Republican Party. And he only wound up becoming president because of a split between the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party split into two factions, and that allowed Lincoln to become president. He only got, I think, 44% of the vote. A lot of people don't know that. Lincoln didn't get a majority of the vote the first time he ran. But, of course, he became the greatest president in history. Now, with all of Lincoln's problems and obstacles that he had to overcome, in some ways, he had an easier path than Grant did. Lincoln had several things going for him. He was incredibly intelligent. He was very ambitious and extremely self-disciplined. He was good at making friends and winning people over. And of course, he was a great public speaker. Well, Grant was none of those things. Grant also came from a humble background. The one thing Grant had going for him was incredible luck. Now, when you read this book, you might think, well, Grant doesn't sound like a very lucky person. He was constantly facing financial ruin. He had, various setbacks in his career. But the point is, every time Grant's back was against the wall, he got an incredibly lucky break. He got into West Point. He managed to wrangle an appointment from West Point, even though he wasn't anybody important. He didn't come from an important family. And he went, after he got out of West Point, he had kind of a mediocre military career, and he resigned his commission and went into private business and failed. And that would have been all we ever heard of Grant, except the Civil War broke out, and that gave him a chance as a veteran soldier and officer. That gave him a chance to get back into the military, and that's where he proved his true greatness, was as a soldier. He was also very successful in marriage. His marriage to his wife, Julia, was the great constant in his life. She was always there for him, always supporting him through all the ups and downs of his life. His military career almost came to an end early on in the Battle of Shiloh. He was almost killed by a stray cannonball. It just barely missed him. And then on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, they were his forces were almost defeated. But night fell, the battle paused for darkness, and Grant was able to reorganize his troops, and then he pulled off a spectacular come-from-behind victory on the second day of Shiloh. If he had lost the Battle of Shiloh, that would have ended his military career. Another advantage that Grant had was that he was serving in the Western theater, where he was less scrutinized. There was less political infighting, less political maneuvering than there was in the East, and that allowed him to basically fight the battles the way he wanted to without interference from Washington. And of course, one of the reasons that Grant rose to the top and eventually became a 4-star general is not just because of his talent, but because everybody else was incompetent. Lincoln went through a whole bunch of generals: Scott, McClellan, Halleck, Hooker, Meade, and several others, and all of them failed in one way or the other. So if everyone else is failing, all you have to be is competent. And Grant was nothing if not competent when it came to war. And then, of course, Grant's final success was being elected president of the United States. He was the only, as this book points out, he was the only president between Andrew Jackson and let's see, what was it? I think Grover Cleveland, to serve 8 years in office. We went through this long period where either people died in office or they were voted out of office. And Grant remained popular enough, despite the scandals that plagued his administration. He was popular enough to get reelected. And when he left office, he was incredibly popular, despite the various scandals. He went on a world tour after he left office and was praised as a hero everywhere. He stopped in London and agreed to give a speech to a labor union group, a trade union group in London, and something like 100,000 people showed up to hear him speak in London. So that just is an indication of just how incredibly popular Grant was. So he got all these lucky breaks when he needed them. The only reason Grant became president really is because of the assassination, the murder of Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was killed, there was a power vacuum within the Republican Party. Of course, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, was a Democrat, and everybody hated him. But there was no one person within the Republican Party who had enough political clout to win the nomination in the next campaign. And so the Republican Party turned to Grant as a unifier. He was, the war hero. Everybody loved him in the North anyway. And so he was the obvious choice, even though he had no political experience at all. His entire career was in the military. Now, one of the things that happened about the time this book came out, and this book was part of this movement of reassessing Grant's presidency. When I was a kid, I was taught that Grant was probably the worst president or one of the worst presidents of all time because of all the scandals that happened and his indecisiveness and so forth. But this book and several others that came out about 20 years ago began to argue that Grant's presidency was underrated. Yes, he had a lot of problems. There were various scandals, but he had a strong commitment to the freed slaves. He did a lot to protect their rights. While Grant was president, he sent troops. Of course, there was the military occupation of the South. He did everything he could to protect them, to give them the right to vote, and to he set up the Freedmen's Bureau and helped support black colleges to give them education and so forth. And so he gets a lot of credit for that from modern historians, his commitment to civil rights. And he was actually one of probably the only Union general who had a Native American on his staff as an officer. He appointed him as an officer. So on the other hand, there was definitely anti-Semitism in Grant's career. One of his most notorious things was he issued an order expelling all Jews from one of the states he was in charge of, which had to be countermanded by Lincoln. So in any case, before I wrap this up, I want to tell you a little bit about the difference between this book and the original version. As I said, the Penguin version that came out about 20 years ago was a pocket-sized book, and it had no illustrations in it at all. This book is not only larger, it's heavily illustrated with some black and white pictures. Here's a picture of Grant's horse that he served in during the war. And in the middle section, there's some really nice colored plates, if you can see here. So there's a lot of really nice illustrations, some paintings and colored maps and so forth. So this is a nicer version, and it's larger and easier to read than the original version. So the Penguin version's out of print. This HarperCollins version is still in print. This is, I think, the version to get if you're interested in reading this book. The book is Ulysses S. Grant, The Unlikely Hero. The author is Michael Korda. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.